US economists say that the United States job market is now sending a very clear signal as we head into 2006, and it is not a signal of momentum or confidence at all. Instead, what we are seeing is a labor market that is collapsing in slow motion. It is slowing tightening in ways that are increasingly painful to job seekers and should be very unsettling for policy markets, unsettling for policymakers. The Bureau of Labor Statistics recent data showed that the United States job openings fell to 7.1 million. This is the lowest level in more than a year. That is actually down from a downwardly revised 7.4 million a month prior, and it is below every expectation. On paper, it might sound like a modest decline. Sure, but in reality, this represents something far more important. It means that employers are pulling back, not aggressively fighting just yet, not slashing payrolls, but they are choosing not to hire. And this matters because the US labor market has been driven less by layoffs and more by people quitting jobs, switching roles, climbing to better pay. And when that churn actually slows, as we see now, opportunities dry up very, very fast. Even if headline unemployment still appears to be low. And what about that unemployment rate? Well, it unexpectedly jumped to 4.6% in November. The most recent data available and released by the BLS. This is the highest level since mid 2021. Now, historically speaking, 4.6%. 6% is not catastrophic, but context is everything in this case. This increase in unemployment is happening while hiring is slowing, job growth is weak, and confidence is completely eroding. That combination alone is what makes economists very, very nervous, and it should make anybody nervous. The hiring rate has fallen back to levels last seen during the early pandemic and also during the aftermath of the Great Recession. In other words, employers are sitting on their hands. They want to decrease their operational costs and they are not willing to expand because there is just so much uncertainty. There is too much uncertainty. Now, the indeed hiring lab summed it up very, very well. This is not a frozen labor market, they said, waiting to thaw. It is one that actually risks cracking. Employers are not confident enough to expand, but they are also quite reluctant to cut deeply. Now, for workers, especially those trying to enter the market or to move up, this is arguably the worst possible scenario. Jobs do exist, but they are harder to find. Openings are posted, but competition is very intense, and employers can afford to be extremely selective. So it is very difficult to actually get a really good job right now. December data from ADP offers very little relief. US companies, according to ADP, added 41,000 private sector jobs, which is better than November's decline but still below expectations. Economists have been looking for closer to 50,000 jobs, and that is not the kind of growth that signals a healthy, expanding economy. So don't let that fool you. This is barely enough to keep up, barely keeping up here. What is striking is where those jobs actually came from. Healthcare and education led the gains along with leisure and hospitality. At the same time, professional and business services shed nearly 30,000 jobs and information lost another 12,000. So the split tells a very interesting story in my opinion. Higher income consumers are course still of course spending they are spending on healthcare, and this is precisely what this is telling us. It is telling us that those with means are still spending, but they are spending on healthcare, on travel, on discretionary services, which is why we did see leisure and hospitality increase, but lower and middle income households are actually pulling back. That is what economists call a key shaped economy. By the way, where one segment continues upward while the rest stagnates or falls behind. And this is precisely what we see in the most recent ADP data. Even within hiring itself, the divide is very visible. Small businesses showed some recovery in December, and that reversed losses from a month prior from November. But large employers, on the other hand, pulled back, and that is important because large firms typically drive stability, drive benefits, and long term career growth. When they pause hiring, as we see now, the ripple effects last longer. The Federal Reserve is definitely watching all of this very closely, I would assume, and sounding increasingly uneasy based on their recent statements just last week. The Fed projected unemployment would peak at 4.5% this year before easing slightly by the end of 2026. And what we can see now is that forecast from last week is already outdated. We have passed that level before the year even started. Fed Chair Jerome Powell did not really sugarcoat it during his last press conference. He did acknowledge that the job market is quote under pressure and that the job creation process could actually turn negative. He warned of significant downside risks, which is a rare admission, in my opinion, from a central bank that spent much of the past 2 years insisting that the US labor market was resilient. Now we know that rhetoric was very far from reality. So, when hiring slows, it is the younger workers, also recent graduates, and marginalized communities that feel at first and hardest. That is already showing up. Actually, a survey from the National Association of Colleges and Employers found that more than half of employers rate the job market for 2026 graduates as poor or fair, which is roughly the same outlook that they had during the depth of the pandemic. For an entire generation trying to start careers right now, this is a very, very alarming signal. Things are not going to improve in 2026, and looming over all of this is uncertainty. We have got tariff policies, immigration shifts, geopolitical risks that are escalating during the first days of 2026, and of course, there is the lingering effects of a government shutdown that delayed key data releases, and all of it makes planning harder for businesses and complicates any policy decisions that the Federal Reserve has to make. So, when uncertainty rises, hiring is usually the first thing to go, and that is precisely what we see now. So, where does that leave us in the labor market that is not exactly collapsing just yet and is just racking enough for us to be very, very concerned? We can be sure that things are not going to improve in 2026. I think we are just starting to see this whole thing unravel. The new December jobs report that will be released later this week will offer another snapshot, but the trend is already very clear. The US labor market is slowing. The trend has become obvious, and unless hiring improves, which would be very surprising, the slowdown is likely to define the entire 2026. For workers, that means tougher competition and fewer chances to move up. For employers, it means holding back growth. They are not going to expand, they are unlikely to invest in expansion, in hiring, and for the economy as a whole. It means an extremely fragile balance. A small shock could tip the scales. This is no longer about whether the labor market is strong or weak. I would say this is about whether it can actually regain momentum at all.